Today on Spirited Science, we have Whiskycast with us. I am so excited. It's Mark Gillespie. He knows all about whiskey. So we're going to talk at length about various whiskey things. Whiskey with an E and whiskey without an E. What is the difference? What are liqueurs? Whiskey liqueurs. All of the fun things. So I'm excited to have you here. We're going to start here in about a minute. Please enjoy this groovy tune. I have no idea who the artist is, but YouTube said I can use it, so that's great. But if you haven't checked out Whiskycast stuff, a link to his work is in the description. And I'm excited. He has an awesome background. You guys are going to love checking that out, man. So many yummy things. And your approximate wait time is about 20 seconds. I got a really nice Glenlivet 12 year and some Saxon. But first, a video to thank my patrons. All right, we are live, so let me unmute Mark here. Thank you, Mark, for being on the show. Why don't you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you know, what you like, what you're up to.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor, and I love talking about whiskey. I've been doing it for the last 14 years in podcast form each week on Whiskycast, and drinking it for years before that. And I've been in journalism pretty much my entire adult life. So I've been given the chance to tell great stories, and now I get to do it and drink great whiskeys at the same time, which I think is really fun. It beats real work.
Oh, goodness. It's like they say, do something you love and you never work a day in your life, right?
Absolutely.
So you recently came back from Dublin. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your trip? What that was like?
Well, I spent last week in Ireland, between Dublin and Dingle, a little town on the Dingle Peninsula on the southwestern Atlantic coast, the Wild Atlantic Way in Ireland, where Dingle Distillery opened back in 2012. They're just about to start releasing their whiskeys in the United States. And so I was part of a small group invited to go over and visit the distillery. So we started out in Dublin for a day or so, then took the 6-7 hour car trip down to Dingle and spent a few days at the distillery, and then drove back up to Dublin for another night of revelry, and then jumped on the plane.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of fun. So a lot of people don't know the difference between like whiskey with an E versus like whiskey with just the Y. And there's a big distinction. I understand a lot of whiskey aficionados are like, no, it's whiskey with a Y, not an E, and this is important. So
Okay, let's get this myth out of the way right now. There is no difference between whiskey with an E and whiskey without the E. The only difference is on where you are in the world. Pretty much everybody in the world spells it without the E, except the US and Ireland. And even Ireland, for years and years, spelled it both ways. I'll explain why they spell it with the E now in just a second. In the US, they spell it with both ways. You look at Maker's Mark, for instance, they spell it without the E. There are other distilleries that spell it without the E in the US. There's no legal requirement except in Scotland where you have to spell it whiskey without the E. Now, what happened in Ireland was years and years and years and years ago, there was a fight between the distillers in Dublin who were making Dublin whiskey, supposedly this high-class gentleman's whiskey, and the distilleries out in rural Ireland who were making a little more potent, little fierier stuff, and they wanted to spell they were all spelling it the English style at the time. This was back when Ireland was still part of England, so they were calling it whiskey without the E. Well, the guys in Dublin decided to differentiate themselves. They would call it whiskey with an E.
Ah, I see.
And eventually, most of those guys all went out of business, frankly. Because by 1965 or so, there were essentially 3 distilleries left. The Jameson Distillery in Dublin, which was run by the Jameson family. The John Power and Sons Distillery in Dublin, which was run by the Powers family, the Power family. And the Murphy family, which owned the Cork Distilleries Company down in County Cork in Southern Ireland. There was also Bushmills up in Northern Ireland, but technically that was still part of England because it's in County Antrim in Northern Ireland. The 3 families decided that to essentially save their butts and save the future of the Irish whiskey industry, they needed to join forces and merge. So they merged their distilleries into one. Essentially, they closed the 2 Dublin distilleries a few years later, moved all the production to a brand new distillery in Middleton. At that point, they were the only ones producing Irish whiskey, and they decided at the time it was easier to settle on whiskey with an E for Ireland, for Irish whiskey. And Bushmills became part of that conglomerate later on. Eventually, Irish Distillers was sold by the families to Pernod Ricard. Bushmills was sold off to Diageo. It's now owned by the Jose Cuervo folks after a few years. But traditionally, it's still called whiskey with an E. There is no legal requirement in Ireland, as far as I know, to call it with an E. And in fact, I suspect when you see the guys at Waterford Distillery release their first Irish single malt in 3 or 4 more years, knowing Mark Rainier, the founder of that distillery, I suspect he's going to spell it without the E just because he thinks he can get away with it. So really, it's just a matter of preference and who's doing the distilling and what they want to call it.
I see.
Just the commonplace rule of thumb is in the U.S., it's generally whiskey with a few exceptions. Outside the U.S., it's generally whiskey without the E with a few exceptions.
Okay. So it's almost like color with a U. Theater is Theatre rather than TER. It's really just a matter of just preference, as you say.
But there is no right, there is no wrong on that. It's really, that's where it came from. Okay,
well, awesome. So people in the chat, hello. Thanks for tuning in. Mark has a question for Mark.
Okay.
Mark Caesar. He's like, how does Mark drink his whiskey? I love it with dry ginger ale or on the rocks. Cola sort of sucks these days.
Well, Mark, that's a great question, and I'm going to tell you the way I drink it. I drink it neat about 95% of the time, or with a few drops of water. But
that's what I've been told about. The few drops of water releases a lot of the oils on the top.
Right. What it does is it creates a chemical reaction, since we're talking science.
Yes.
It creates a chemical reaction, an exothermic reaction, which, as we all know, creates heat. It releases the oils, releases aromas. And as things heat up, they expand. It releases the oils and the aromas in a whiskey so you can smell it better.
Ah.
That's why you add a few drops of room temperature water.
Yeah.
Now, what happens when you add ice is you actually create the opposite effect. You close it up because things, as we know, contract.
Right, right.
So it kills the nose.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I don't put ice in whiskeys when I'm nosing for serious reasons. If I'm doing tasting notes on a whiskey, I'm never going to put ice in it, and never more than maybe 4 or 5 drops of water with a pipette or an eyedropper. But
awesome.
On a day like today where it's 85 degrees outside, if I'm drinking a glass of whiskey in the backyard, I have no problem throwing an ice cube in there.
You know, I do like a good mint julep. I have to say, I really do like a good mint julep. Brian G says, drinks on me. Cheers, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for the super chat.
The other thing you want to be careful about when putting ice in whiskey is you got to watch out where that ice came from. If you take it out of your freezer and the ice tray or the ice maker, and you've got something in that refrigerator or the freezer, like, say, garlic or fish in a container that's not really well wrapped really well, that aroma can get into the ice.
That's true.
As it's freezing, it can taint the ice.
That's
going to come out in your whiskey.
Gas. It can hold different gases. You're right about that.
That's why really serious whiskey nerds and bar owners who have more money will actually invest in a separate ice making system.
Wow.
And there are special ice making systems for bars where it's designed so that it freezes the cube from the inside out to the outside rather than the outside in, so that it pushes those gases out.
Wow.
And it's nerdy, it's expensive, but it works.
That's a whole level of nerd I did not realize existed for whiskey.
Oh yeah, you can go completely full-blown whiskey nerd here, and I use that term affectionately because I am one.
There is not a thing wrong with that. I actually was gonna talk with you. I used to absolutely hate Scotch whiskey, all of it. I hated all of it. I tried to drink and I'm like, oh, this is like drinking burnt wood. It just wasn't flavorful at all. I mean, I hated it. I will tell you what got me hooked.
Okay.
I was in Gatlinburg, okay, and in Gatlinburg at the time, before the Great Fire that happened, they have a lot of distilleries out there. And there was a distillery called Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett whiskey. It was right across the street from the moonshine place. There's a place called Old Smoky Moonshine or something.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So they're across the street. I never toured their distillery. I happened to be walking by Davy Crockett, and they were like, hey, we have this whiskey. I'm like, okay. We're like, well, here's a free sample. I'm like, free booze? Okay. I will not say no to that. And it was salty caramel whiskey.
Yeah.
The salty caramel whiskey from Davy Crockett tasted like melted candy. And I was like, and then I moved from that. I went to like their cinnamony flavored ones. And then I went from that to straight up whiskey. I'm like, it just was a progression from going from the melted candy flavor to here I am drinking Glenlivet.
You are proof that there actually are people who make the transition from flavored whiskeys to regular whiskeys.
Yes.
And I've been trying to find proof of this in industry statistics for years and haven't been able to find anybody yet who could tell me that actually people do make this transition from these flavored starter whiskeys.
Yes.
Now,
it was a gateway whiskey for me.
Here's how I get people to try whiskey for the first time when they're like you. They hate whiskey at the beginning. What I'll do is give them a glass and put in a 50-50 mix of room temperature water and whiskey, say half ounce of each.
Okay, fair enough.
That knocks the alcohol level down from about 40% down to around 20% or lower, which is actually where professional blenders will evaluate because they're evaluating looking for faults, and they can tell the faults when they're nosing. But what that does is it reduces the intensity of the whiskey so that you don't get as much smokiness, you don't get as much alcohol burn, and it gives you a chance to ease yourself into it as you drink a little bit more later on. Then you reduce the amount of water gradually until you're adding just a little bit. And it sort of, you build up your taste for it.
You do. You absolutely do. That's, and one of the first after I got from Davy Crockett, I was like, okay, what is the best whiskey ever? And I was asking friends who love whiskey, and they're like, Lagavulin, go for that. And then maybe an Oban. And then so I started trying all of these different ones, and Lagavulin was amazing. And then I got hooked on Oban. I'm like, I'm a high-end whiskey person. I can't drink Jack Daniels. I can't drink. We were talking about Southern Comfort. People consider that a whiskey. And you're like, not today.
Well, no, it's based on a whiskey liqueur. And what it is essential, it's a whiskey liqueur that's based on whiskey, but they put herbs and honey and things like that into it. Okay. And it falls into a category of whiskey liqueurs or flavored whiskeys. And the way you can tell is because it's bottled below 80 proof or 40% ABV. They're allowed to go down to 30 to 35%.
Right.
That's why you'll see they look like whiskeys, but it's like a Drambuie, for instance, which is the same thing. Comes from Scotland. They'll put some orange flavor into it. They'll put herbs into it and a little bit of heather and things like that, natural herbs. It's almost like infusing it like a gin infusion when they're distilling gin, and they'll put herbs and botanicals into a gin basket. They'll do this with whiskey and make a whiskey liqueur out of it, or essentially a flavored whiskey.
Right. Let's see.
And for the record, since you pointed out your Glenlivet,
yes,
I just opened a bottle of Bruichladi's Islay Barley 2011, which was just released. It is made on the island of Islay in Scotland, one of my favorite places in the world. And it's actually made from barley all grown on the island.
Oh, wow.
And this was distilled in 2011 and released this year. So it's about 8 years old. It doesn't carry an age statement, but it carries the vintage 2011. And I received this bottle the other night just because they've launched it in the U.S. And I figured since the Islay Festival of Malt and Music, Fégil, their annual week-long whiskey bash on the island that draws, well, essentially, Islay has 3,000 people year-round, about 10,000 sheep. And during the Fèis, the population of the island, the sheep and the people are equal. That many people travel to the island for the festival.
10,000 people. How big is that?
No, 7,000 or so. But twice as many people that live there travel there for the festival to go around. Each distillery has its own day. Pardon?
How big is the island?
It's big enough to hold 9 distilleries now.
Wow. Okay.
And it's 20 to 30 miles across in some places. You have to drive. You can't walk it. It's not like, we're not talking Gilligan's Island here.
Okay. So it's like probably an hour drive from end to end, something like that.
Oh, yeah. You could easily take an hour to drive from one end down at Port Nahaven, down on the Molavoa, the peninsula, all the way up to Port Escaig at the other end, up where Kalila Distillery is, and the new Ardnaho Distillery. So
this particular festival is based all on whiskey and with how they make the barley and stuff. So is there a theme every year, or does the theme change, or is it always?
It's always whiskey, and each distillery has its own special open day with a festival and music and food, and the festival bottling that people start lining up for the day before.
Oh, wow.
And immediately start flipping them on eBay as soon as they can, or the whiskey auction sites. There are people who, and I detest this with a passion, will actually pay somebody to stand in line for them, get a bottle of this whiskey, take it off the island, and turn around, and immediately within hours, it'll be on one of the auction sites.
That's like scalping. You have whiskey scalpers.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
It's also illegal in a lot of places too.
Mark Caesar just said, tell Mark thanks, tried the whiskey and water for the first time, and it really makes it so much nicer.
Thank you, Mark. Good job. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So that's awesome. Brian G says, I like Hennessy's Honey Mellow. Is Hennessy a whiskey or is it a liqueur?
It's a brandy.
It's a brandy. There you go. Okay. I've never had Hennessy, so I cannot speak.
Hennessy is actually a cognac, and the difference is basically cognac and brandy are the same thing. They're distilled from wine as opposed to grain. But cognac comes from a specific region, the Cognac region of France. So it's sort of a subset of brandy. Just like champagne can only come from the Champagne region of France, cognac can only come from the Cognac region of France.
Well, I know, I just recently purchased a type of wine. It's a French wine. It's an aperitif.
Hmm.
And so it's like extremely sweet. I could not drink it straight. And I found I was mixing it with various things to try to give it a go. I've seen some cocktail recipes that use it with whiskey. And I'm like, so I wonder how that would go together.
What
But
wine was it? I'm not familiar with.
I think I still have it in my fridge over there. But it's basically it says it's a French wine and it's Apertif. I don't remember the
Okay,
brand
aperitif is like a before dinner wine.
Yes.
It's
something
designed
like
to, it basically is designed to sort of get your appetite going, get the juices flowing and get you hungry.
They're
As opposed to
ridiculously
digestif, which is more of a whiskey, which would be an after dinner
My
type
goodness.
drink.
I couldn't drink a straight glass of it. It was entirely too sweet. I thought,
Oh, I don't
oh my
blame you.
gosh, like it was just too much.
That's about the extent of my wine knowledge. I don't have enough time to focus on wine. I spend all my time focusing on whiskey because I thought I'd run out of stuff to talk about on whiskeys a few years ago, and after 14 years, I haven't run out yet.
Oh my goodness. Somebody mentioned Red Stag is good.
It's another one of these flavored whiskeys.
Yeah, another flavored whiskey. I do like a flavored whiskey, but I like the salty caramel types. I like that, but I don't like it as much as just straight up whiskey now.
That's great. That's the idea, is to use those as a way to ease your way in. And hopefully Mark will attest to this now that he's tried it with a bit of the whiskey and water. Anybody can learn to like this.
Yeah, it takes.
I mean, there's whiskey out there for anybody.
There probably is. It's funny. One of the things that I would do is I have friends that live out in London, and I used to travel there like a couple times a year. And I would always stay with a friend of mine who lives out near Kew Gardens. And one of the things was that I always had to bring Davy Crockett salty caramel whiskey. And then I also had to bring Slap Your Mama Cajun seasoning and some cornbread mix. And so then I would make a southern dinner for them. And then we would sit around and drink our salty caramel whiskey. But they don't have Davy Crockett anymore. So I've had to replace it with Sugarland. So
Sugarland Distilling is making some good stuff.
Mm-hmm. They have.
I've had some of their rye whiskeys, and they're making some good whiskey too.
Oh my goodness! All right, so a question from H. Hemphill: ask Mark how the cask changes the whiskey with wood sugars, etc.
Okay. Basically, when whiskey comes off the still, it's clear, and that's sort of why they call it the water of life. It looks a lot like water. It's clear; you can see right through it. What happens when you put it into an oak barrel, especially a charred oak barrel, is you start getting this chemical reaction as the whiskey soaks into the wood. You get extractive reactions where it's basically taking compounds out of the wood, things like vanillins. It takes the color out. You get some of those caramel notes, the brown sugar notes that are created. You also get notes that where the charcoal from the charring inside the barrel will filter out some of the impurities in the alcohol and will filter out some of the harsher flavors. So what you get is a combination of chemical processes over time that science still hasn't quite figured out exactly how it works or how to make it consistent. But that's basically what's happening inside the barrel. The fun thing is it changes from barrel to barrel. You can take 3 barrels of whiskey, filled from the same still run, fill them 1, 2, 3 in the filling store. And the same day, put them side by side in the warehouse.
Same temperature,
the exact amount of time,
conditions.
Same temperature, same conditions, and there's a good chance all 3 whiskeys will be completely different when you taste them later.
Okay, here's a question for you.
That's what makes this so much fun. And that's what makes single barrel whiskeys really unique, is that you can't replicate that. And it's part of the reason why it's hard for scientists to accelerate whiskey production for maturation, is because you can't even get it consistent on a regular basis, let alone what happens if you try to start messing around with the process.
You can't replicate it because of the natural qualities of the wood is varying between each barrel. Here's a
and
question.
each tree is different. Each tree is a little different.
You're right. We still have that thing called genetics and alterations in those genes. Even a little bit can manifest.
Buffalo Trace did a great project several years ago, the Single Oak Project, where they created 192 different barrels of whiskey.
Okay.
And what they did was they cut down, I believe, 96 trees
Okay.
in Missouri, in the Ozarks.
Okay.
And they specifically selected these trees to be turned into barrels. But what they did was then take each tree and cut it in half.
Mm-hmm.
So you had the upper half of the trunk and the lower half of the trunk, and then made a barrel specifically from the top half and the lower half of the tree.
It was different, wasn't it?
So and that's one of the things they were testing for, was to see whether it actually made a difference in where those staves come from. Because most of the time in a cooperage, when they're making a whiskey barrel, they take staves from a bunch of different trees and put them together so that they get a consistent flavor.
I see.
So that no one tree has an impact on the overall flavor.
I see. That makes sense. I would think that also the fact that, the way that trees grow and the fact that gravity is a thing, you're going to have alterations towards the lower part of the tree versus the top part of the tree. So you're going to have like stronger, heftier wood towards the bottom because that's where the base is. And it's going to be a bit, weaker maybe at the top.
Well, you also get more nutrients that are getting pushed in the bottom half of the tree, so you get more of those compounds that are creating the sweeter flavors, the sugars and things that are coming up. Not as much of that food, the nutrition, gets up to the top of the tree.
That's true. So here's another question. This was a question I was actually going to have, Mark.
Okay.
Does that mean that the barrels lose their ability to flavor the whiskey after a few batches of whiskey has aged in them?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's like a tea bag.
Yeah.
What happens is with bourbon, you can only use the barrel once.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is they use the barrels to make bourbon. Then those barrels wind up going to a broker that there are usually long-term supply contracts in place, and those barrels get broken down and sent over to Scotland, Ireland, Japan, any number of countries where other whiskeys are made.
Right.
Canada especially. And then those whiskeys get used in what's called in Scotland a first fill barrel, in Scotland and Ireland. A first fill ex-bourbon barrel. It's been used once for making bourbon. Mm-hmm. Now the bourbon has taken all the harsher compounds out of that wood.
Right.
But it still has a lot of the sweetness in there. And there's still some bourbon in the wood too.
Right.
So what happens is the Scotch guys will, for instance, use that maybe 2 or 3 times. Mm-hmm. They might call it a first fill or a second fill, and they might use it that first time for whiskey for 12 to 15 years.
Wow. Okay.
The bourbon guys have maybe used it anywhere between 2 and 10 years, let's say, depending on which whiskey comes out of that in bourbon.
Oh, okay.
So you can use this barrel up to 3 or 4 times, and then after that third fill, let's say, the second time it's been used for Scotch.
Right.
By then, the barrel's pretty well wiped out because everything's been taken out of that outer layer of wood on the inside of the barrel. Mm-hmm. The whiskey's all soaked in. It's taken everything it's going to get. At that point, you can do 2 things. You can either sell the barrel to somebody who's going to use it for a garden planter, or you can use it for grain whiskey for blended Scotch.
Huh.
Because with grain whiskey, you don't want as much of the wood impact. You want the distillery impact. You want basically clean grain to serve as clean grain whiskey to serve as the base.
Right, right.
So it's not going to have as much of an effect on the grain whiskey.
Huh.
So you can put it back in, you put grain whiskey into that and let it sit there for another 20, 30 years if you need to. And at that point, that barrel's pretty well wiped out at that point. But what you could do also, instead of using it for grain, is a process called rejuvenation. You take it to a cooperage, they break down the barrel, plane down the inner layers of the wood, remove that outer layer, retoast it or rechar it, put it back together again, and it's a rejuvenated barrel. You've got some fresh wood exposed, and it's not going to be as good as a brand new barrel or a first fill barrel, but you can get another use out of it. You can get another 12 years out of it.
See, my head immediately goes to, I bet that would be great for like smoking some ribs. Like, you're to take something after it had been used 20 some odd years, you take that, put it in a smoker, and then, oh my gosh. See, now I'm Southern. I'm going to barbecue.
Well, the best thing to do in that case, what I'd do, I wouldn't even wait that long. What I'd do is go over head over to Tennessee and go over to Lynchburg or Tullahoma to use Jack Daniels or George Dickel and get your hands on some of that sugar maple charcoal that they use to filter the whiskey.
Oh, there you go.
Because they basically take that once it's dried out, they take that and package it up and sell it as charcoal.
Oh, wow.
And that's got fresh whiskey infused into it. You can put that in a smoker.
Oh, I bet.
And it'd be a lot cheaper than trying to get your hands on a barrel. Because then you got to chop it up and cut it down to something you can stick into a smoker and all that. And it'd be it's a lot cheaper and easier just to go get the charcoal.
Yeah.
Or just because you go to the hardware store, you go to Home Depot, you can buy that barrel for $50. Or buy that half barrel garden planter.
Yeah.
And if you look on the bottom of it, you can see where it came from because they probably haven't sanded off the stamp on the bottom on the head that's on the bottom of the barrel. They probably still got. I've seen barrels at the hardware store that still have the Jack Daniels lettering on it and the stencil on there that they put on marking which barrel it came from.
Pro tip: go to your local DIY store. Look at the barrels; they probably had whiskey in
If it's a real barrel, if it's really charred, it's not these fake barrels, but there are barrels out there that if you see where it's been sawed through the middle, and there's a bung hole cut out, where you can see half of a little arch bung where the bung used to be. Chances are they bought it and they basically took an old whiskey barrels, and actually cut the real thing down.
Yeah, and they repurposed it to sell.
And they recycle it and use it as a garden planter. They used to, before there was a demand for a massive demand around the world for these barrels, distilleries in Kentucky would give them to the employees to use as garden planters. They'd give these things away.
Oh my goodness.
Now it's going to cost you, at least if you're buying it in bulk, it's $100 to get a bourbon barrel.
Wow.
Because distillers around the world need them.
Yeah. All right, here's another question from H. Hemphill. Ask Mark about how the shape and height of the stills affect the taste. Okay.
This is a chemistry question.
All right.
We're talking distillation. Here's what happens in a still. You've got the essentially distiller's beer that's come out of the fermenter, and it's somewhere between 5 and 10% alcohol by volume. What happens is you put that into a still. As you raise the temperature of the still, remember, we're talking alcohol boils off at a lower point than water.
Right.
That's the whole purpose of distillation. You're separating off the alcohol from the water and all the other stuff.
Right.
And you have lighter alcohols that come off first. The methanols, the stuff we really don't want. That's why when you hear somebody talking about the heads and the tails and the hearts, the heads are the stuff that the moonshine guys in the backwoods have to filter out or they're going to kill somebody. Because that's where you get methanol poisoning and the stuff that if they don't cut it properly, what happens, the way you can tell is when it's coming off the still, you take a glass like this with your spirit, put a little bit of water in there. If it turns hazy, it means the bad stuff is still in there. So you don't start saving it. Only when it turns clear is when you've got the good stuff. That's if you don't have a hydrometer to do it right.
I see.
So what happens is, as these alcohols rise, you have a still that's, for instance, is shaped like this. As the alcohol rises, it comes into contact with the copper as it rises above the still. Only the lighter vapors get all the way up and over the still. The heavier stuff gets knocked back down in what we call reflux, just like acid reflux in your stomach. It gets knocked, it knocks it back down, makes your stomach upset. Well, it knocks those heavier flavors down back into the still. So if you're like Glenmorangie, for instance, where they've got these really tall swan neck columns with a line arm that, say, bends off like this. Well, only the lightest vapors are going to make it over the top and then be recondensed into liquid.
Right.
Now, if you've got a short, squatty still that's like this, more of those flavors are going to get up over the top.
Right.
And so you're going to get oilier, thicker, heavier flavors, more like some of the fusel oil type alcohols that are going to get in.
Right.
That are drinkable in this form. When I say fusel oil, don't panic. There are different grades of alcohol. What we're talking about, the good stuff is the ethyl alcohol or ethanol.
Right, the stuff that you can drink and not go blind.
But there's also the stuff, but more of those flavors are getting over.
Right. Okay.
And that's where the difference is in the still shape. Now, what you have in some stills, you'll have, instead of it being straight up, it'll be like a ball, where you'll have this part, what they call a boil ball, and then the swan neck. What they're doing there is trying to get some of those lighter flavors up and then knock them back down because it comes into contact with the copper, it reacts and comes back down.
I see. Okay. Well, that makes sense.
Then you got column stills, which are a completely different animal.
So the shape of the still is largely due to what kind of flavors you want put into your
You
whiskey.
decide what ahead of time when you're building your still. You decide the flavors you want, and then you design the still that you think is best going to create those flavors.
Huh. Okay.
And then you find out whether it actually works or not, and then you go back and pound some more copper into place and redo it until you get what you want.
Oh,
This was all done trial and error 200 years ago.
Okay. I'll take a few more questions here, and then we'll talk a bit about where did whiskey come from?
Okay. We'll start some trouble.
Yeah, okay. So, Mark Caesar again says, I distill my own spirits and find that they improve with age in a glass bottle. What would be happening there since there's nothing to impart flavor? Well, I think that depends on what the actual alcoholic beverage is. I think they would all react differently and are made quite differently.
Here's where I have to be the killjoy.
Okay.
Let me emphasize that, one, it is illegal under federal, state, and pretty much every local law to distill your own spirits at home in the United States. Two, it is also extremely dangerous, and you can blow yourself up real easily because you're dealing with high volatile alcohol and flames generally, which generally do not mix, and people have blown themselves to hell and back by making stupid mistakes while distilling in professional distilleries. Therefore, if you are not a professional distiller and have no clue to what you're really doing, unless you're a trained professional, do not do this at home. Okay. Now that we've basically shot Mark's dream of becoming the next Jimmy Russell down, what's happening is you're exactly right, Mel, on this. It's what went in before. You get garbage in, you get garbage out.
Right.
If you put something good in there that you like, you can redistill it. I know I've got some friends over in France where they can do this legally that have taken what they refer to as the big bastard still. One of these Olympic stills that goes around on a truck to various farms to distill their brandy and Armagnac for them. And they've taken a bunch of whiskey and put it in and redistilled it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And taken that and then put it into a barrel for a while. And it comes out really cool. But what they've done is they've taken a bunch of bottles of stuff that they didn't like or had it left over or whatever reason and just poured the leftovers in and redistilled it.
I see.
And these guys knew what they were doing and had professional guidance. So I would never advise anybody to try distilling at home. That said, a lot of craft distillers have done exactly that, distilled in their garages until they realized what they could make and until their families found out what they were doing in said garage and said, you're not doing that in this garage anymore. And so they decided to go legitimate. But put it this way, it is illegal to distill at home.
Yes.
Especially not
is a
because
bit different, but you know.
It's illegal because you got to have a federal permits. They're more worried about the tax revenue on the alcohol, frankly.
Ah, I see.
So you can make home beer and home wine for legally, but you cannot distill spirits yourself at home.
Ah.
Oh, I hate to be the bearer of bad news.
That's a shame. I'm sorry, Mark Caesar. All right, so Steve
And
Bowden.
that's a pseudonym, right? So just in case anybody from the Tax and Trade Bureau at the Treasury Department is watching this.
That might have been a hypothetical question.
I hope it was a hypothetical question.
That was probably a hypothetical question, as we have no evidence that he actually does that.
Other than his word.
Yeah, so maybe.
Okay, so, yeah.
So, all right, so Steve Bowden asked, please ask Mark about Retsina and if I'm wrong for liking it so much. I think is that a wine? Or?
It's a Greek wine. I've actually had Retsina. It's been, 30 years since I've had a bottle of Retsina. It's, how best to describe it? It's like drinking liquid licorice. Really thick, really spicy, and, it's been, like I said, honestly, I haven't tasted it since probably since I got into wine in the late 80s, frankly, for a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, Retsina is a wine. And I'm sure you could probably, if you distilled it, you could probably make an interesting brandy out of it. But I haven't had that in years.
Wow. Nana gave us a super chat. By far my favorite subject. Well, thank you for the super chat. And I'm so glad you're enjoying this. It's nice to actually, instead of having a cocktail and talking about a scientist, we're actually talking about the process of making whiskey. I've used whiskey in my Darwin cocktail. I've used whiskey when I talk about Katherine Johnson. I've made a derivation of a mint julep, except with peach sweet tea. That and a nice Kentucky bourbon.
I'll give you my favorite mint julep recipe.
Okay,
take a sprig of mint. You take all the other stuff that goes into it. You take 2 ounces of bourbon, pour it into a julep cup, set all the other stuff off to the side, and drink the bourbon.
I have to say, as often as I go to New Orleans, I'll go to different places and ask for a mint julep. Just, I'm like, I want it, and it's like... Oh,
New Orleans, no, you don't order mint juleps in New Orleans. You order Sazeracs in New Orleans. You want good mint juleps, go to Louisville.
Louisville? Okay.
Go to Louisville because they go anywhere in Kentucky. They know how to make good mint juleps.
They know how to do it. And
I'm not talking the stuff they made in the trash can for the Kentucky Derby. They know how to make good mint juleps. I mean,
oh goodness.
And the real ones where they actually put the mint stuff in and all that.
I don't know. I think you might like my Darwin recipe. I
probably would. I will admit that I've gotten more into cocktails in the last couple of years, but to me that's chemistry. And I'm going to be honest with you. There is a poor woman who has a very special place in heaven right now. Leota Skirvin was my high school chemistry teacher. Sophomore year of high school in Nashville, Indiana. This poor woman tried to get me interested in chemistry, tried to teach me chemistry, and I would come in every afternoon and fall asleep on the desk. If I knew then what I know now, that I was going to be covering the distilling industry for a living, I would have paid a hell of a lot more of attention.
Well, I'm an analytical chemist, so, at least that was my master's. I can tell you what's in a thing based on instrumentation. That's mostly what my background was.
Most distillers these days are coming out of chemical engineering.
Oh, wow. That's cool.
Chemical engineering programs. There's nothing to stop you from going. Matter of fact, one of my favorite people in the whole industry is Dr. Dagmara Dabrowska. She is the chief chemist at Irish Distillers at Middleton, at their distillery. And she is this amazing woman with multiple degrees who comes originally from Poland and went and told all these Irish boys what was in their whiskey by using mass spectrometers, gas chromatographs, HPLC technology. She was able to break it down and tell them what was actually in their whiskey and how to make it better.
Oh gosh, it's just by molecular weight. You can do HPLC, you can do gas chromatography. It's just mass spec is pretty definitive for the most part. They have a massive database. I had a qualifying exam on that actually. Anywho, let's see, we got a super chat in. Tell Mark hello from Highland Hill, Bunkai. So that was...
He's one of our regular listeners and a follower on Twitter.
Awesome. And so he also asked, what does Mark think of gassing whiskey? And by the way, Mark, Caesar's in Australia, so we're safe.
Okay, good. Okay. We're safe, although Australia is even more restrictive in some ways, but I don't know about... I mean, it was only 20 years ago that they legalized whiskey distilling in the first place.
Well, okay. So Hill, what about gassing whiskey? What are your thoughts on that?
Let's explain the process here.
Okay.
When you take a bottle of whiskey and you open it, whiskey does not generally age in the bottle unless the cork does not have a good seal.
Right.
And allows oxygen to come in. And what happens, what a lot of the wine guys like to do is they'll use these nitrogen doohickeys.
Right.
And basically remove all the air and displace it with nitrogen to keep whiskey from oxidizing.
Exactly.
Or to keep their wine from oxidizing. Now, whiskey can oxidize, theoretically, once it's been opened, if this cork is not tight and allows air to come in into the bottle. And whiskey can oxidize over time.
Oh, yeah. I did a thing
So
where
that's what he's talking about is, should we do this with whiskeys?
Yeah. I've left a gas out and seen what, not gas. I've left a glass. I've only had one of these.
Right.
It was 2 fingers. I actually can drink a lot. I've partied with Vikings before. So, yeah, I have 2 fingers. Or, 2 fingers.
These are my 2 fingers.
Your 2 fingers are probably larger than mine.
No.
But gassing, yes, there you go.
So with gassing whiskey, what you're talking about is actually replacing the air inside the bottle with nitrogen or another inert gas to prevent oxidation.
Which keeps it at the same condition it was at the time of bottling.
Now,
essentially.
If you want to do it, hey, more power to you. If you want to spend the money, go ahead. I've never done it. And I've got bottles that I've had for 10 years that I've never had an oxidation problem yet. The only time I've had oxidation problems is with sample bottles. Maybe did had screw caps instead of corks.
I see.
Or didn't have as good a seal on them. Where I find trouble is after old bottles, the cork breaks when you try to open it. But as long as it's in there, I've never had a problem yet. And I've got whiskeys that I've had for 10, 12, 13 years. And I've never had a problem with oxidation yet in a good bottle that's been well sealed.
Right.
Now, if you really want, I can save you a lot of money here because those oxidation things cost a lot of money. If you really want to be anal retentive about this, go get some saran wrap or cling film and put a couple of inches, put a wrap of cling film around the top of the bottle. It'll save you the cost and it's going to be a lot more effective. And you're not going to have to buy all those nitrogen cartridges to refill the doohickey. Because that's what I would do. If you really are worried about oxidation or a loose cork, take some cling film and put it around or shrink wrap and put it around the top of the bottle.
It works.
That's all I would do.
Yeah. Fair enough.
And that gives you enough money to buy more whiskey.
Yeah, priorities.
Priorities.
So Brian G asked, could you ask Mark what online stores are good for ordering what you can't find in stores? So special orders. I think a lot of stores can special order stuff, though. Yeah,
most stores can do special orders. Here's the problem. I need to know what state he's in because every state has its own regulations on shipments and whether they'll accept shipments from in-state or out-of-state and especially out of country.
I see.
And that's the problem. You've got 50 different states with 50 different regulatory systems. And there's no easy way to tell which one is going to work. There are good, reputable online retailers that say they can get their products into the U.S. What they're doing is they're shipping them through a licensed importer in the U.S. and then repackaging and then breaking those shipments down and resending them on. There are reputable ones. We've got some. We've listed some on our website. I hesitate to give recommendations because of the legality of shipping whiskey across state lines.
It's like in my state, I can't get anything delivered to my house.
Right.
I can only go to like a retailer and go, I would like this whiskey, and then they can order it in, and then I can buy it from them. But I can't just order it and have it delivered. Like wine of the month does not exist here. So I can't do that in my state. So, it depends on where you are in the U.S. and that sort of thing.
Right. The only thing you can do on that is if you live in one of those states, lean on your state legislators. Although you've probably got more important issues if you're in one of those states. You've probably got bigger priorities to lean on them about.
Yeah. It's like where I live, they just started selling wine on Sundays. So
I grew up in Indiana where we couldn't even get cold beer at the grocery store, but you could buy beer at the grocery store, but you couldn't buy anything on Sundays until just recently. You could only buy cold beer in a liquor store. You couldn't buy cold beer at the grocery store.
Liquor stores are closed on Sundays out here. You can buy cold beer and wine after 12 noon. So, and that the wine thing only just happened like last month.
Here's where here's the explanation for all that. Basically, when the 21st Amendment was passed that ended prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
It gave every single state the right to decide for itself how it was going to regulate liquor.
Okay.
And every single state came up with its own system.
Yeah.
You've got still, I think, about 15 or 16, maybe 17 control states where the state controls everything from wholesale to actually owning the retail stores.
Right.
To free-for-all states where it's completely privatized.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got a mix of, every state has its own individual regulations, whether they allow full-proof beer or limit it to 3.2% beer, things like that.
Right.
And it also allows them to regulate distilleries. I mean, it's amazing that we actually have as many craft distilleries as we have in the United States, given the fact that every single state has its own regulations.
Mm-hmm.
I think last time I checked, they're making bourbon in at least 48 states, including Hawaii, but I could be wrong about that. And I think there's actually a bourbon distillery up in Alaska.
A part of me really wants pineapple bourbon now in Hawaii. I just like,
Please don't say that.
Pineapple bourbon.
Don't say that. No, there's pineapple vodka. Go drink vodka for that.
I have vodka. I have triple berry, or I think it's like triple berry vodka over there. You know, it's like, but if you put frozen fruit in it, it makes it healthy.
Rationalizing is scientists rationalizing is amazing.
You know, it's lots of, you have lots of antioxidants, vitamin C, and some fiber.
Hey, whiskey is gluten-free.
You know, it's gluten-free. It's absolutely gluten-free. All right, we have a few more questions.
And I did ask the question about this because I did ask during the distillation process, the gluten-y stuff doesn't come over the top of the still. It doesn't get distilled into the whiskey. So whiskey is generally gluten-free.
Good news for celiacs.
And for the GMO crowd.
Oh God, GMO. That's
okay. For the GMO crowd, because I've asked this question of people who have chemical engineering degrees and have actually done the science on it, and none of the stuff that they genetically modify in corn for bourbon makes it through the distilling process.
I mean, it's just
all the Roundup Ready stuff and all the Monsanto stuff or whatever.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Basically, there are distilleries that specify GMO-free grains because they want to be able to sell in Europe.
Yeah.
Because of the European Union restrictions on GMOs. But anything that's genetically modified generally winds up in the waste products of the distillation process. It doesn't make it into the final whiskey. Nobody I know of who's done chemical analysis has found glyphosate or Roundup in whiskey yet.
And
if somebody proves it, I want to know about it.
So I have a different show that I do called This Week in BS that actually aired last night, where I talk about the glyphosate and all of that. The court cases that are coming out.
Right.
To be able to prove something in court is far different than scientific fact, and a lot of people conflate the two. But courts tend to lean towards awarding the victims or supposed victims of things just to err on the safe side in case it is a thing that happens. But a lot of the science that's presented that say glyphosate is a cancer causing, only causes cancer in mice, and it's at such copious amounts to where no human would actually have that much ingested. You should
have to do shots of Roundup on Friday night.
Every
Friday night.
A lot in one setting, and it's just, and how it manifests in mice is not the same as how it would manifest in people. And so a lot of what I try to do here is say, okay, I understand people are scared, but you have to kind of delve through this and dig down and go, okay, GMO really is not a thing. And if we didn't have genetically modified organisms, that's what that is, then we would not be able to feed the majority of the country right now. That's the reason why we have access. I mean,
there are good reasons to be against GMOs just because of the Monsanto monopoly on the farm industry and the business side of things. There are reasons to be opposed to GMOs just because of the way The business side is, but the scientific side,
it's good stuff to help people. The business side is predatory and wrong. So
right.
I get that. But yes, that's my little soapbox on that. So, all right, we have another whiskey question, and then we got to talk a bit about the history of it. All right, so is there still a problem with oxidation if the bottle is half empty / full?
No, as long as you keep it sealed, although sort of the rule of thumb would be that once you've opened a bottle, it's best to maybe drink it within a year.
Mm-hmm.
To go ahead and finish it off within a year. If it's half full, it's a good excuse for a party. Go finish it. But I've got half full bottles that, like I said, I have one up here. Oh, stretching. It's not on that shelf.
All right. And if you're worried, Saran wrap is the savior of your whiskey.
Yeah, this thing is Compass Box Canto cask. I've had this thing for... And see, we just had a cork break.
Oh, crap.
But the solution for that is simple, because this is why you always keep your corks when you get rid of a bottle of whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
What I'll do with this after we get done tonight is take a corkscrew and go down very gently into this, pull it out, and then take what I'll do is find another cork, essentially, that fits this. And before I drink it, what I'll do is maybe run it through one of those coffee filters, like a paper coffee filter, just to filter out any cork that might have fallen down when I was pulling the cork out.
Right.
But I'll just put another cork into this because I keep probably a bunch of corks for bottles that are various sizes that'll fit into this.
Just for this reason.
Just for that reason, because it's happened before.
See,
but
you're a smart man.
Well, no, just because I've had experience with this. But I don't know if you can see the level of this in the camera or not.
Oh,
but,
yeah. That's about...
It's right at the bottom of the label.
So it's about a fourth left.
Yeah, and it's still fine.
Yeah.
But because this cork is dead, what I'll do when we're done tonight is go basically put another cork in there.
Yeah.
I'll just gently remove the other cork, the old cork, and put a new cork in. And move on from there.
Awesome.
Pop that bottle back up.
So we're getting questions on your personal preferences for particular whiskeys.
Okay.
Brian G's he says, I'm looking for a Dimple Pinch 15 year. Please ask Mark what he feels about that one.
Dimple Pinch is one of these traditional historic blended Scotch whiskeys. And the dimple and the pinch comes from the dents in the side of the bottle, where it was indented on all three sides, so it was sort of pinched in. That's where it came from, these dimples that were pinched into it. Perfectly good blend. I haven't tasted it in years, but always liked it. If you can find a bottle of it for a 15-year, I haven't seen one with an age statement, but if you can find one, go for it.
Somebody in Nana asked, have you tried Beluga or Russian Standard? I'm wondering if that's vodka. I have not had Beluga or Russian Standard. When I see Beluga, I think caviar.
What?
But that's me.
Yeah. When I think Beluga, I think back to Alaska because I used to live up there and we used to see the real Belugas all the time. But those are vodkas, and I generally, pretty much absolutely do not drink vodka unless forced.
No carbs, though.
No taste either. True vodka is not supposed to have any taste to it.
That's why you mix it with stuff like
That's why you got to put crap into it to make it taste good.
I really like a vodka milkshake. I'm not going to lie.
You might as well you're drinking a milkshake where you put vodka into it. It's not a vodka milkshake.
Some almond milk and some frozen berries. Toss some vodka in there, a little bit of Splenda. I can get my calcium, and I'm rationalizing.
Yeah, that's fine, but you're not. But you're drinking a milkshake with booze in it.
What's wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with that, but I prefer my drinks to have some taste to them. And there's better stories behind whiskey than vodka.
Well, perhaps. All right. So I'm scrolling through and trying to find some more questions. Oh, goodness.
So should we start some trouble and to talk about the origins of whiskey?
Sure. I think we're caught up on questions. So I'm reading all kinds of different origins of whiskey. anywhere from Mesopotamia to Ireland to
Well, distilling itself started back in Mesopotamia.
Because of archaeological digs that found
Right.
casks.
Well, brewing has been around for thousands of years.
Uh-huh.
The cavemen were brewing stuff. They figured out fermentation and figured out how to get hammered on whatever they could get hammered on. Og and Ugg were pounding themselves, pounding whatever they could find back in the day. But the early roots of distillation started with, we believe, the Moors, the Muslims, in Africa, North Africa, millennia ago. That's where the name alcohol gets its name from the Arabic word alcohol. That's the actual origin of the word alcohol, is alcohol.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And what happened is that, as many things did back then, it got co-opted by the monks and by the church. The monks this was at a time when most people were completely illiterate, and stories were passed on verbally rather than written down.
Yes.
The monks were the only educated people of the time.
Right.
They figured out distillation. They learned distillation from the Moors. And then as the monks moved through Europe up towards England and Scotland and Ireland, and throughout Europe, they took this technology with them. Now, they already had fermentation up there because they were making beer.
Right.
Nobody knows who invented whiskey. The Irish will tell you they did.
Of course they will.
The Scots will tell you they did.
Yes, we have them to thank for golf.
And the Kentuckians will tell you that, yeah, the Scots and the Irish did it, but we perfected it.
We made it better.
Yeah. So nobody knows for sure. My best guess is that the Moors probably hit Ireland before they hit Scotland, just coming up the coast.
Yeah, well, that would make sense.
So and also because the earliest known references to Ushkabaha, or early whiskey, come from the Annals of Clackmanoise in about the early 1400s, where it refers to a chieftain who died at Christmas of a surfeit of Ushkabaha. Because he basically drunk himself to death.
Oh, that stinks.
And in 1494, we have the oldest known written reference in Scotland to whiskey production. Friar John Court, Lindores Abbey, the Exchequer rolls where he was granted 8 bowls of barley to make malt for the king.
Right.
1494, we have that. So theoretically, it started in Ireland and then moved over into Scotland. Keep in mind that essentially all this was under British rule at the time. Various rules of various kings. This was all back when basically everybody was fighting each other on a regular basis, sort of like the soccer game that never ends. And I kid, of course. I have friends over there.
Yeah.
But they were all essentially, it moved back and forth. And essentially what happened was, during colonial times, we had Scots and Irish moving to the U.S., or to North America, to the New World.
Right.
We also had European immigrants to the New World, and they brought rye with them. And they were bringing their native grains with them.
Right.
And distilling them over in the U.S., in what we now call the U.S., in North America. But they were doing it all up through Canada as well. So it is hard to say who created whiskey. But we know that once they created it, they figured out how to move it around. And that's where the barrels came into place. Early whiskey was drunk. One of the questions that came in early this week when we started talking about doing this session was about what the differences are of why water is the root of so many things like aquavit, Ushkabaha, and the water of life and all that.
Right.
It's because when the monks were making this stuff, it came off the still clear, like water. So they were drinking it. It was called Ushkabaha, or aquavit, the water of life.
Can you imagine drinking it straight off the distillery, though? How is that?
They were drinking it for medicinal reasons. And they felt really good after they drank it.
Hence, we get all the snake oil peddlers that go,
Right.
are rampant through the U.S. in particular parts of,
And
history.
and another term, if you go back to the days where, let's just say, the less politically correct days of American history,
Mm-hmm.
where we had the references among American Indian culture to firewater.
Right.
It was clear whiskey that could be set on fire because it was alcohol. That's where the name firewater came from.
Mm-hmm. I just, it's pretty interesting because I've seen lots of different shows. One particular thing was something called Frontier House that PBS did for a little while, where one of the guys was a CEO for a company, and you were allowed to bring one modern day thing, and he chose a distillery, essentially, like a little distill setup. It was a copper distill.
Smart guy.
He could go, smart guy, and he ended up selling it as like a type of tincture potion thing or whatever, and
which was what the monks were doing. Exactly.
That's exactly what they were doing. So it's a little bit of, it's kind of interesting how the beginnings of pseudoscience kind of started among this fire water, this water of life type of thing.
Yeah.
And I actively work and debunk some of the nonsense that people think,
Oh, yeah.
drink this and it cures your cancer. No, it doesn't. It just makes you feel good for a short period of time. It's like, and then you don't care so much about the fact you have cancer for like a few hours, and then you wake up the next morning and it sucks again. So,
I'll tell you what, I've told my entire family that all this stuff behind me, when I'm gone, they're either to have a hell of a party with it, or I want a Viking funeral.
That is certainly fair. Cheers, man. That's a good way to go. I always did not like the idea of a funeral. I was like, you guys have to hire a DJ, maybe have a freaking disco, party the frick down. I'm like, do you know how this woman lived? Oh my God, she lived. She freaking lived.
Are you kidding? As much as this stuff as I've drank, if you tried to cremate me, you'd blow up half of southern New Jersey, for crying out loud.
You are thoroughly pickled.
Yeah. Well preserved.
Well preserved. There you go. You're a well preserved gentleman.
Okay, so what's the next question?
Let's see. Oh my goodness. All right, so Hib Hill says peat was used to dry malted barley because they didn't have enough wood. Proof was testing that gunpowder would still burn.
Yeah.
So, how about we talk about the term proof and where that actually came from? Because
it started with the British Navy and their rum rations, and also with the pirates and buying rum in port. What you would do is you would take a little, to prove that it was actually alcohol, you would take a little bit of the rum or whatever and pour it on some gunpowder, on a little pile of gunpowder. And if the gunpowder ignited, then that meant it was proof. That was proof that it was 50% above alcohol.
Right.
Or above alcohol, because if it wasn't, then it wasn't proved. Because if it was water, it wouldn't ignite.
Right.
So it had to be at least 50% for it to ignite. And the movies actually got this right once. In Kingsman: The Golden Circle, there's a scene where the cowboy, the bourbon distiller Tequila, is soaking down our British heroes with some bourbon as a technique to get them to confess something, and talking about how, they had proved that they had light this on fire to prove that it was actually alcohol. I bet you boys would talk if I lit your on fire by throwing a match on those pants.
Yeah.
And the story was right, and the reason they got it right was because they had a consultant from Brown Forman behind the scenes who explained all this to them ahead of time.
So I hear lots of different myths behind proof. Was proof also used as a means to deter people from purchasing alcohol in the U.S., particularly around Prohibition time?
No. Proof was always used to prove that it was alcoholic strength, that it was of legal strength.
Okay.
Or that it was of sufficient strength to actually be an alcoholic beverage.
Okay. Okay.
Because 50%, that's where the same reason we have the bottled in bond designation.
Mm-hmm.
Keep in mind that during the 19th century, up until the Bottled in Bond Act of, I believe, 1897,
Mm-hmm.
whiskey generally wasn't bottled very much from the distillers. They were sending it out in barrels.
Okay.
Those barrels would go out to wholesalers or go out to what the wholesalers of the day, and they'd wind up in some saloon, which would take it straight from the barrel.
Oh,
and these
God.
guys would cut it with anything they could, just like drug dealers today. They'd cut it with tobacco juice. They'd cut it with water. They'd cut it with caramel, molasses, anything to make more money off of selling the whiskey out of that barrel.
Oh, my goodness. So they would have their own special drinks.
And with the 1897 Bottled in Bond Act, what that was essentially the government seal of approval, that it was guaranteed to be matured for at least 4 years under government supervision in a bonded warehouse and bottled at a minimum 50% alcohol by volume or 100 proof.
Wow.
And once the government put its stamp of approval on the thing, then people could buy a bottle of it knowing that they had something that was actually the real thing. It wasn't going to kill them.
Wow.
That became really important after Prohibition because we had all these bootleg gin recipes with methanol and everything and people dying.
Oh, God.
Because of illegal booze, and conspiracy theorists and others saying the government was actually poisoning what it could get into the system to make sure that, to try to deter people from drinking illegal booze. So after Prohibition ends, those distilleries that waited a few years, like, for instance, Heaven Hill, to do a bottled in bond bourbon that was actually under the proper supervision, that's what sold on the market, was because they could prove that it was actually the good stuff.
Yeah. Gosh, it's just, it kind of blows my mind because when you sit here and you hear about people with conspiracy theories and that sort of thing, and then you see like kind of what's going on with the current administration, you're like, maybe they weren't wrong, kind of, but maybe they were wrong, but then what kind of world, you know what I mean? Just...
I like to think of it as, no, they were wrong, but nobody ever thought it would get to this level where they might actually appear to be right. I don't think the Founding Fathers ever anticipated something like this.
So probably not. And, you know, to be fair, we've only had one actual scientist ever been a president, and that was Thomas Jefferson. That was the last and only scientist we've ever had to hold office. There
was a congressman that from central Jersey a few years ago who actually was a rocket scientist. Dr. Rush Holt was elected to Congress, and he campaigned with campaign stickers that said, "My congressman is a rocket scientist."
We have had medical doctors be congressmen. So it's just, I don't... Oh, that's another talk.
Yeah, that's another talk, and we can get into a whole lot of trouble there.
You know, I haven't even tried this Sexton yet. I've been drinking.
Oh, you should.
I've been drinking
the Sexton. Well, you pour a glass while I explain what it is.
Well, I have to finish Glenfiddich.
No, you don't.
Well,
get a second glass.
I do have a second glass, actually.
Then get a second glass.
You know, it's right here. Due to the miracle of television, I have it in my special fancy container.
Grab a second glass. Now, the Sexton comes from Casa Cuervo, Jose Cuervo, the folks that own Bushmills.
Okay.
It is a single malt Irish whiskey, and we know it comes from Bushmills because only in the last couple of years was anybody else other than Bushmills producing single malt whiskey in Ireland, other than Bushmills or Cooley. And when you've got Bushmills, when you own Bushmills, you don't need to buy whiskey from Cooley.
Okay, so just comparing the two colors. Here's Glenfiddich. All right,
yeah.
So it's pretty light.
Yep.
This is much darker, right?
Yeah. You know why?
Much darker. Different barrel, right?
No.
No, not a different barrel.
It's a little thing called E150 caramel coloring.
Preservatives and colorings.
No,
okay.
not preservative. It's a coloring. You are allowed in Scotch whiskey to put a small amount of caramel coloring into the bottle. Irish whiskey, you have a little more leeway with.
Okay.
But you can put caramel coloring in. But these guys, put it this way. I know I've tasted Bushmill's 16-year-old and 10-year-old single malts, and their 21-year-old single malt, and I've tasted the Sexton single malt, and I guarantee you there is no way in hell that is a 10-year-old single malt. Color is deceiving.
Color is deceiving. Okay.
Unless you're taking it right out of the cask, color is deceiving in most whiskeys.
This is all the fancy jargon on the side of the Sexton bottle. Follow that scent into the crypt, and you might find a locked door, faintly glowing at its edges. Through that door, find the rows of beckoning European oak. Once the sacramental casks of fine sherry, now brimming with aqua vitae.
I wish I could write bullshit that good.
You see to be
That's a
Sexton.
master copywriter at work.
Yeah, I could probably get paid to write stuff like this. I mean, if you're looking for someone to write stuff that sounds really sciencey and kind of poetic, hit me up. So, you see, to be a sexton is a spiritual trade, and whiskey is the favorite spirit. Yeah.
That was written by the marketing department. I guarantee you there wasn't a distiller in the room when that thing was written.
But, it's interesting.
I kid because I can, but I'm
sniffing between the two.
The whiskey is okay. I mean, it's a pedestrian whiskey. I guarantee if you put that next to Conor McGregor's Proper Number 12, you're going to taste a few of the same notes.
Okay.
Because I'll bet you there's some of that in Proper 12.
It tastes, it has a bit of a slight sweeter flavor than the Glenlivet. Mm-hmm. A slightly sweeter flavor. It's not nearly as light. The Glenlivet is a bit lighter than this. This feels a bit heavier on the burning aspect of things. And it has I don't know if that's brown sugar or what that is that's in there.
It could be. It could notes of brown sugar. It could be molasses, things like that. It could be the barrels because they hint, at least on the label, that they're using some sherry barrels in there.
Right. Well, I Probably.
The bourbon barrels will give you a lighter color and a lighter flavor.
And it is a lighter flavor. So yeah, this feels a bit heavier. It feels a bit heavier. It tastes a bit heavier. It has a bit of a sweetness to it the Glenlivet doesn't have. Mm-hmm. So, it has more
sherry casks in it. And the sherry casks, to be fair, could also account for some of the color.
Right. Yeah, that's okay. All right. Somebody does Mark think E150A changes the taste of whiskey?
No. Because essentially in the amounts they're putting it into it, and the reason they put it in is to get consistency in the color between bottles, between batches. Because marketing folks like to think that if somebody sees multiple bottles of, say, a whiskey like this on the shelf, and they're all slightly different in color, that they're going to be inferior. So there's a reason why they chill filter to get all the little flocculation, the oils and the solids that are not quite miscible, that don't quite dissolve into the alcohol.
Right.
They filter some of that stuff out in chill filtering, but they also want a consistent color between bottles, between batches, so that it always looks the same on every store shelf and behind every bar. So the amount of E150 they're adding into a vat when they're putting a batch together is just barely enough to create a consistent color.
Okay.
I don't think it's not, you would have to pour a bunch of it in to affect the flavor.
And I wonder what that flavor would be like.
Caramel.
It would taste like caramel.
And you're already getting a lot of caramel in some whiskeys anyway. So it's a flavor you're already getting, but it would be just more accentuated.
Mm-hmm. And that's largely due to the
elements in the wood, the interaction with the wood.
Right, because of the sugars in there.
Yeah, so I put it this way. I would be very hard-pressed if you gave me a sample of the same whiskey before the E150 had been put in and after. I don't think there'd be a taste difference. It's that minimal. It's
that minimal. You know, I wonder what the striking difference is.
I mean, I don't think it's. I think it's. I understand why they do it. It just I don't like it, but I get why they do it.
You know, I wonder. Okay, so when I'm looking at this and I'm like reading all of this poetic, whatever.
Yeah.
You know, so up in the cold grays, northern reaches of the county Antrim, the Sextons. Okay, I mean, it sounds really sexy, which, you know, I guess, you know, if you want sexy whiskey, go get Sexton. But
yeah, the bottle looks great.
Yeah, the bottle
and
looks great.
And it's not a bad whiskey. It's not a bad whiskey at all. It's not a great whiskey.
But it's like the varying flavors between this and like the Glenlivet. I mean, it's such a strong change, you know, and so that's why this is why I can't drink Jack Daniels.
Keep in mind that like the Sexton, like most Irish whiskeys, is triple distilled. It goes through 3 sets of stills. Glenlivet goes through 2 sets. It's a little more refined. What they've done with the Sexton, though, is that there's more sherry barrels in the mix that add more molasses notes, more toffee, a little heavier notes. If you don't like sherry, you're not going to like this one.
Right. Well, I mean, that's certainly fair. You know, I don't know. There's something really nice about a super light and smooth whiskey.
You got any water there?
I can go get some. I actually
go get some. I want you to try this after. Go get us that and just take, like, if you got a bottle of water, take a capful and let's put it in and see what the difference is. Now that you've tasted it, I want to prove this.
Okay. Let me go get some water.
Go get some water. I'll entertain the folks for a bit.
All right. You know, maybe sing a song.
I won't sing a song. Let me do the tasting notes on this Isla barley thing. When you get an Isla barley, and I have to pull my glasses out to get the ABV on this thing. It is at 50% alcohol, which is nice. Right now on this Isla barley, I'm getting a little bit of toasted oak, a lot of barley sugar from the maltiness. There's a little bit of honey underneath, not much peat. Their base Bruichladdich whiskeys don't have a lot of peat to them. They save the peat for the Port Charlottes and the Octomore level whiskeys, but the base Bruichladdich is not generally a heavily peated whiskey. A little bit of toasted bread to it. It's very warm. It's a very warm whiskey. And on the taste,
it's
a nice warm, spicy whiskey. A little bit of clove, a little bit of cinnamon. Some honey, some dried flowers underneath, a little bit of vanilla. Finish nice, long, just a touch of pepperiness right on the tip of the tongue, right there. Nice. I like this one. Okay, so let's take a capful of water and put it into that Sexton and see what it does.
Okay. I have like Brita filtered water, so I'm going to put just
That's fine. That's what I use.
A few drops.
That's all you need. I'll generally, like 4 or 5 drops is all you need.
All right, swirling it around.
Now smell it and see if you can smell a difference.
It's a bit lighter. It's not near as heavy. Yeah.
Okay, go on.
All right, so I'm going to have a sip. That's not near as heavy as it was. A little bit lighter.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of smoother. Color changes a little.
Yeah, there's an argument for putting just a little bit of water in.
Just a little bit.
The only reason I do it neat is because I'm trying to taste it the way the distillery intended it to be released, as the distillery released it when I'm doing a critical tasting. But I'll add the water to see if it makes a change that would affect the way I feel about the whiskey.
Right. Well, that's certainly fair. It's not near as strong as it was, and it's not near as dark.
And you only added a little bit.
Yeah, I only added a little bit. It's probably like 3 or 4 drops or something like that.
And it's more drinkable now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not like want to punch you in the teeth.
Okay.
Fill it all the way down your throat. Like, just, like fist right there. Somebody said it's like it puts hair on your chest. No, it really hasn't, so it's fine.
I'm looking away.
My grandfather, oh my God, my grandfather was in the Korean War, and he would sit there and he loved to make chili and grilled cheese, and he was like, this will put hair on your chest, and I was like, well, it won't do that for you. So we would say that to like my male cousins, and I'll be like, okay, he had no response for us ladies in the family.
Well, back then he didn't think you'd be drinking whiskey either.
Yeah, probably not. Probably not at all. He were like, oh, you're drinking whiskey. I'm like, yeah, Grandpa, I know things. So it's I don't know. I don't know how my grandpa would take me drinking whiskey. He's seen me drink wine, and he's kind of a fundamentalist now. So I'm like, okay, well, I don't know.
I have joked many times about my late grandmother, who was a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, foot washing Southern Baptist woman who would not have alcohol in the house. She made my poor grandfather give up drinking. And when I saw my aunt a few years ago, when I saw her, she said, your grandmother would not approve of what you do for a living. And I go, oh yeah, I know. She's up there in heaven right now trying to get God to unleash the lightning bolt arsenal to go take pot shots at my ass.
Oh my goodness. It's like when I was in grad school. It's interesting because my grandparents came from such a different time. My grandparents had no idea that I had the capability. I'm the only person in my family on both sides since we got off the boat coming to this country to have 4 degrees. My sister has 2. My brother has 1. We are the most educated people in our family on both sides. And my grandma looked at me and she goes, how are you so smart? I mean, she just had no clue. And I was trying to explain to her the research I was doing in graduate school. And they're from such a different time. My grandma never had a job. She never went to university, never went to any kind of community college. It was marry, Navy husband, have babies, stay at home, do mother things. I mean, that's it. So it's just such a strange, different thing to sit there. And my grandpa would be like, he doesn't know how to talk to me. Because I'm like, Oh, yeah.
I was the first one in my family to go to college, and my wife was the first one in her family to go to college.
Yeah.
And yet, when I sat there and tried to help my daughters with their math, it's, what the hell is this?
Oh, yeah.
And let alone science, because they're sequencing DNA and all that. I'm going,
with PCR.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're about to get interrupted for a second.
That's okay.
Hey, buddy.
He can say hi if he wants.
Come here. You got to go to bed.
Bad language, dude.
Yes.
Bad language.
This is Hunter. Okay.
Hi, Hunter.
Okay, dude.
Don't even argue.
Okay, go to bed.
Good night, Hunter.
Love you, buddy.
You sure have a lot of pinkies in your office.
Go, dude. Good night.
Hunter is going to be very wise when he gets old.
He's either going to be very wise or he's going to bullshit people into thinking he's very wise.
Well, either way, a successful life.
I love the kid.
Okay.
We got any more questions?
Any more questions? I don't see any more questions at the moment.
We had that one question. Did we address that one from Sean that came in earlier this week?
You talked about it being the water.
About the aquavit and the various different definitions that came from water.
If you want to get into that, you can go for it.
Well, we did sort of, I think, address it earlier because
a little bit, yeah.
when you had things like the terms that came out like aquavit, the water of life, all these terms for whiskey that related to water. And that was because of the monks, because those were all descended from when the monks were making their whiskey in the water of life in the aquavitae, and it was all clear like water.
Oh goodness!
So that's where all those terms came from, because that was 200 years before we started putting whiskey into barrels to mature, and the wood is where the whiskey gets its color from.
You know, I wonder how different is the whiskey prior to the aging in barrels versus straight out of the distiller.
Oh, it would have been a lot fierier. I don't know if you've ever had new make straight off the still.
I really haven't, and I'm a bit scared.
No, there's no reason to be scared. I've tasted it many times, and yeah, it comes off at somewhere between 60 and 70%, depending on the distillery. But it is fiery, it's intense, but you can get the distillery character, and you can taste, if you taste the new make and then taste the aged whiskey, you could taste some of that character still, if they're doing it right. The wood doesn't take it all away. Okay,
so when we're looking at, and I had mentioned my story about Davy Crockett versus the Moonshine Old Smoky. What are the variances between like Old Smoky Moonshine in a jar that's like clear? I have never had that at all because I'm a bit terrified. What do you think about that? Because
it's what it is. It's stuff straight off the still. It's watered down a little bit. It's not the pure stuff straight off the still, because you couldn't get away with that. It'd be too strong. So it's knocked down to a reasonable level. But yeah, I mean, it is what it is. It's new make spirit. It's young. It's fiery. The wood tames it. That's where those extractive compounds is what the wood takes out of the whiskey.
Right.
And filters it down and makes it a little softer and a little smoother.
Right.
That's what because the frontier guys were basically drinking moonshine back in the day. That's when the guys realized when they were making whiskey in Kentucky and putting this stuff into barrels, sending it down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers down to New Orleans. By the time it got down there, it had been sitting in these barrels for a few months, and it came out pretty good. And that's when the word got back up to Kentucky, hey, we need to put this stuff into barrels and let it sit. Same thing with the guys in Scotland, because what they were doing is they were putting it into barrels and hiding it from the excisemen. They put it into a small quarter-sized cask, put it on the back of a donkey, and take it between villages or whatever, and that's how you got it around the excisemen. And they realized that, hey, you put this stuff in a barrel for a while, it tastes pretty good.
Wow. Oh, goodness. Okay, Hemp Hill has another question. Does Mark think whiskey can ever be synthetic and good? Obviously not Glyph.
You're going to have to listen to this weekend's Whiskycast.
Stay tuned.
No. Here's the reason why. Because I talked the other day in New York City at the Wall Street Journal's Future Festival with the guy who founded Glyph Whiskey, company called Endless West out in Chicago or in San Francisco. And you're going to love this being a scientist. They wanted to create what they called a molecular whiskey.
Molecular. Everything's molecular, but okay.
No, but here's what they did. And it was an interesting process.
Okay.
They ran several hundred whiskey samples from whiskeys from all over the world through the mass spectrometer, the gas chromatograph, HPLC, and tried to isolate the molecules that give whiskey its flavor.
To try to figure out essentially what are the components of whiskey that make the best whiskey's whiskey.
And then what they did was they sourced those molecules and components from food suppliers, from food science companies that produce these molecules. And they layered those amounts, they layered that stuff in, those molecules in, on top of grain neutral spirits, basically vodka, and a small amount of new make whiskey, essentially stuff straight off the still to comply with federal regulations.
Okay.
And they created Glyph. And we're going to have the whole story this weekend on the show.
Okay.
And this was not predetermined. I actually didn't get the interview until after I'd already agreed to do this. This was not a setup.
So
But
check out
I
Whiskycast. You guys have to go listen to Whiskycast.
But I tasted I tasted the stuff. I've tasted it twice now, and it's not bad. It's not the greatest whiskey in the world. I did admit that I would have a hard time picking it out of a blind tasting. And if they can make it that well, okay. I mean, it's not the greatest whiskey in the world, but I wouldn't turn it down. And what they did was they layered these. It has the same flavors.
Right.
And this differs from these accelerated maturation technologies where basically people are taking new make or young whiskey that's been aged for, say, 6 months and then running it through processing machines, pressure cookers, essentially, pushing it through wood, do the extraction, and try to do the stuff in a day or two that it takes years to do.
Yeah, to shorten the time.
And that's not what this is. These guys are trying to make something that tastes like whiskey.
Right.
That they could do overnight. And the problem is they can't. They ran through a whole bunch of legal issues with the federal government trying to label it.
Right. How do you label that?
Well, because you can't. That's why they had to put the base whiskey in. Because the federal government in the U.S. defines whiskey, just as the Europeans do, as a distilled spirit made from a fermented mash of grain.
Right.
Well, if you're not fermenting and you're not distilling, and there's no grain, you don't have whiskey. So what they did was the fermenting and the mashing part came from the GNS and the new make spirit.
Right.
And the government would not let them call it whiskey. They put it into a category called spirit whiskey, which is where you're allowed to put other stuff.
Right.
That doesn't quite meet the definition of, say, a straight whiskey. That's where they put it.
So Nana is asking for a link. If you want a link to Whiskycast, I have put a link in the description, but I'm happy to put it here. It's literally whiskycast.com.
And we're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, most of your major podcast apps and smart speakers. You can find the show.
Right. So absolutely. So if you're curious, I've tried to put, I guess the hyperlink I put wasn't fantastic in the side chat, but it is in the description.
That's what happens when you try to drink and type at the same time.
And I did it on my phone. I was trying really hard to not be loud, because
I have fat finger syndrome trying to type on the phone.
Sometimes I have sausage fingers. But, hey. But whiskycast.com, check them out. We're like, do we want to kill this in like 20 minutes? Because that's like 2 hours we've been talking.
I can go as long as you want. I got plenty of time. If there's questions, I'll go as long as you want.
Well, awesome. Yes.
I'm just going to finish this. I had this Racer 5 IPA sitting here for a while that I haven't finished.
Do you know? Okay, so just as an aside, so on Saturdays, tomorrow I'm doing a show. Tomorrow morning, I have Saturday morning science. So I actually did a show on pairing beer with barbecue. And I talked a bit about the history of IPA and the fact that India Pale Ale actually comes from the fact that they had to add extra hops to it so it wouldn't spoil on the trip to India for the British folk. So the IPA is extra hoppy because the extra hops lessened the spoiling, whatever.
You're talking about barbecue. You want a good barbecue recipe?
Oh, okay. We're going to probably have to fight about this. I don't know.
Oh, you're going to love this.
Okay. What's your barbecue recipe?
This is one my wife came up with a couple of years ago. Lafroig pulled pork.
Okay.
You take your basic pulled pork. You let it sit and simmer in the crock pot.
Right.
But you put about a quarter to a half a cup of Lafroig scotch into it, the peaty stuff.
Okay.
And you just let it sit there and let it get all happy all day long.
I'm on board with this. I approve of this.
We actually have a recipe for it on the website.
Oh my God. Okay.
And we also have a recipe for her combination drunken salmon, drunken tenderloin,
Oh, wow.
where you take a Tupperware container. You can take either a salmon fillet or,
Mm-hmm.
say, a pork or a beef tenderloin,
Mm-hmm.
lay it out in the Tupperware container, and put a half a cup to a cup of your favorite whiskey in there.
Mm-hmm.
Put the top back on, let it sit in the refrigerator all day.
Yeah.
Come back home and put it on a grill.
See,
And that is
like good food.
And we've even brined the Thanksgiving turkey in an entire bottle of Johnny Walker Red
Okay.
without blowing up the house in a gas stove.
Oh my gosh. You know, people don't know how to properly like treat their meat. So it's like, you
But
know,
no, we brined it in, and it picked up all the alcohol cooked out,
uh-huh.
but all the flavors stayed in,
They were still there.
and it was amazing.
Oh
And the
my
house
goodness.
smelled great.
See, when I go to London and I'm, you know, and so one thing that I do, I'll get like a lot of the dry rubs here. And I'll get the different, that's my dog. And then I'll get like the different, you know, as far as sauces, those are separate. But what I do, if I'm, you know, if you're overseas and you want to try to get some kind of barbecue, what I will do is I will boil a pork butt for about an hour in vinegar and water and cook it down. But then I'll get like a heavy dark ale.
Yeah.
And then I'll slow cook it in a dark ale with the dry rub. And then I'll chop it up and then I'll add the sauce. Oh gosh, yeah. Now I need barbecue. This is wrong.
Here's my restaurant recommendation. The Bison Bar in Dublin.
Oh my
They
gosh.
do barbecue about as well as any place I've ever found in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost as good as most American places. I mean,
See,
it's actually barbecue worthy of Americans.
my London friends, why have we not gone to Dublin? So I'm just like, oh my gosh. I'm like,
But
get
the
really
Bison
excited
Bar,
about that.
they're actually doing a big
Oh,
barbecue
gosh.
thing this weekend.
Okay, so, okay.
Barbecue and bourbon thing this weekend. But they actually do barbecue. I was there the other night, and they do barbecue. I have a feeling they kidnapped a couple of Americans and brought them over.
Oh, see,
A couple of good old boys from Tennessee or someplace
Yeah.
and taught them how to make barbecue because it's good stuff.
See, I
But
always
this
thought,
Lefroy pulled pork is just,
see,
that is, we're talking, you used the slap your mama spices term. It's that
yes,
good.
yes. See, that's required of me when I go and stay with my friends in London. Bring Slap Your Mama, Cajun seasoning, Davy Crockett, salty caramel. If not, Sugarland is a good, you know, and then cornbread mix. You know, I actually, every time I go through TSA, because it's too heavy to put in my luggage, I have to carry through. They check it for gunpowder. So TSA has certified that my cornbread mix is gunpowder free. So there you go. So,
How much cornbread mix are you taking, for crying out
It was-
loud? That
it
should
was
fit into a checked bag.
it was 10 pounds.
Good Lord.
You know, but I'm a very caring visitor, and yeah, it's funny because I look similarly to the person who owns the house, and she has a pass to Kew Gardens, so like her image is on the card. I'll just hold it up, and like they just wave me through. I'm like, yay! I don't have to pay like 40 pounds, which is like almost $60. So,
Let's hope they're not watching this either.
yeah, you know, no, Kew Gardens doesn't care that much. Although I have live streamed from the Science Museum, and they do know that I do this. So, anywho, but yeah, it's just I always thought if I lived in London, I could probably go as a teacher because I am certified to be like a teacher. I can teach 3 subjects in the U.S. right now.
Right.
But if I were to go, I would have like a side hustle as like a soul food kitchen. Because every time I go, I cook for my friends, and like, this is amazing. Like, I know it's way better than your pub food.
Oh, I love pub food.
I do too. I like a good proper, fish and chips, but or a good, Sunday roast is fantastic. But if they burn the Yorkshire pudding, I get really upset.
I would try this Lefroy pulled pork recipe.
Mm. Oh my goodness!
Because I would try that because I think you'd like that one.
I probably would. I'm going to check out your website. I feel like I need to do this and make certain it's repeatable for science, of course.
Of course.
So,
research is important.
It's extremely important to have repeatable results.
No, we have a lot of resources on the website that people aren't aware of. Everything from a list of whiskey-related dog names. If you wanted to find a name for your dog, that's actually one of the most popular pages on the website. For some reason, it shows up in our popularity numbers on a regular basis because people are looking for names for their dogs that are whiskey-related. So we've got them on there. We also have a list of good whiskey shops around the world if you're traveling, goodness. Good whiskey bars, once again, if you're traveling, whiskey clubs if you're looking for someplace, if you're looking for a whiskey club to join in your area. We've got a few of those.
A whiskey club.
And we also have my tasting notes for close to 2,600 different whiskeys.
All for your convenience, viewers.
I've sacrificed my liver for you guys.
That's exactly true.
All in the name of science, of course.
All in the name of science.
I kid, of course. I like to joke that I have the greatest job in the world. I've been in journalism and media and broadcasting for my entire adult life. And I haven't had I've never had more fun than doing this show because I get to go out and talk to great people. I get to tell great stories and I get to drink great whiskeys and I get to have a lot of fun.
Oh my goodness. I have to say I've had a bit of whiskey this evening.
I think it's last call time. What do you say?
It probably is last call. We have about maybe 15 minutes left. If you have any questions for Mark, hit us up in the side chat. I can hold my whiskey pretty well. I have a friend of mine named Alexander, who's a descendant of Vikings. He taught me how to drink in London.
Okay.
They have this thing called the round system, and I didn't become keen to that until like my third or fourth trip. When you go with a group of people, there are unspoken rules that are social rules that they have that are extremely British. You're not loud on the tube. Don't be loud on the bus. You don't want to peg yourself as the loud American. You don't make eye contact. And then you get into like a pub where everybody buys a round. It's the round system. And so I was there one summer for a couple of weeks. I went and we were hanging out in Camden. We went to the World's End. If you've not been there, it's fun. Why not? And so we're hanging out with friends. I went to somebody's birthday party. We already had some wine and it was like, hey, I'm going to buy the first round. And I'm like, okay. And then they buy the first round and then you buy a round and somebody else buys a round. The key is get a really tall drink. Like a super tall cider, and then it takes a while to get through because if you're drinking wine or some small whiskey, when you're done with your round, somebody else buys it. So if you're with a large group, you'll have like 8 or 9 people, and that's 9 rounds of 9 different people buying you a drink. It's like, oh, all of a sudden, Mel's on the floor. How is she going to get back to her hotel? We'll put her on the tube. I've managed to navigate the tube in very various compromising situations. But fortunately, I have friends that care about me and made certain that was okay. But the thing is that's how I learned. Get a very, very tall glass of cider. Then that's like 6, like 4 to 6 rounds. And then, oh, hey, I'll have another cider. Thank you. So it's like, oh gosh. So yeah, so the round system.
The key to avoiding that in the first place is to drink some water in between each round.
I will have a glass of water. Thank you. See, that's smart. That's smart, Mark.
Well, because the water hydrates you, because what happens is that when you have a hangover and when you drink, it actually dehydrates your brain tissue. As the alcohol metabolizes, it dehydrates your brain tissue and your brain shrinks a little bit. That's why your head hurts so much in the morning.
Well, yeah.
So when you drink water, you keep yourself hydrated, and the alcohol absorbs itself into your system slower.
So the only way I learned how to effectively handle the London scene was hanging out with descendants of Vikings, where they're much larger people than myself. And
Well, we do preach responsible drinking at Whiskycast.
You do
know your limits.
Yes, know your limits. So I learned my limits hanging out in London with people, fortunately, that cared about me enough to get me on the tube and back to where I needed to be. We won't talk about the hotel room that was flooded. That's another show. Oh, I was sticking it to the man that evening, I feel. This is a very posh hotel. Anywho. Oh, goodness, now it's awkward silence.
I didn't say anything.
I know, hence the awkward silence. Anyway.
No, I'm listening.
But, let's see. Ciders I do enjoy. Beer I cannot drink, sadly. So, I don't know.
I am not much into ciders, only because, for me, I enjoy the non-alcoholic apple ciders too much to start confusing those with whiskey or to start confusing those with alcohol.
Yes.
But when you think about it, beer is essentially, whiskey is what beer wants to be when it grows up.
Is it though?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Whiskey is distilled beer.
I don't know. See, okay. The reason why I can't drink beer, and this is kind of gross, is because when I'm ill, that tastes like beer.
Okay.
So when I'm like really sick and it's gross sick, that tastes like beer to me. So anytime I drink beer, it tastes like I'm drinking my own illness, sickness. So.
I'll tell you why I'm drinking this Racer 5 IPA tonight. It's actually a whiskey-related reason.
Okay.
You remember the wildfires out in California last fall? Northern California?
Yes.
Well, Charbet Distillery out in Ukiah, California, is one of the few distilleries that does a lot of stuff where they distill hopped beer, fully matured, fully brewed beer.
Right.
Where you get the difference between beer and whiskey is that once you've made the distiller's beer, but the fermentation process, that's where, when it goes off to beer, that's where you put the hops in and let it sit for a couple of weeks and stuff like that.
Right.
Instead, beer goes straight off to the still. Well, what Charbet likes to do is these things where they distill fully hopped beer. And about 2013, 6 years ago, they distilled a batch of this Racer 5 IPA from Bear Republic Brewing and put it away in barrels. It's being bottled now. And what they're doing is donating some of the proceeds from the sale of each of this Racer 5 aged whiskey to a charity that is supporting the wildfire victims in Northern California.
Wow. That's cool.
So that's why I've got some of this, is because they're sending me a sample of the Racer 5 aged whiskey. So I went out and picked up a 6-pack of this so that I've got a beer to compare it to, the actual beer to compare it to when the whiskey sample comes in.
Well, that's cool.
So that's why I joke about whiskey being what beer wants to be when it grows up, because that's essentially what whiskey is distilled beer.
Huh. I wish I could enjoy beer as much as you.
That's fair. Different spirits and different drinks for different folks.
Absolutely.
I'm not going to. If you want to put ice in your whiskey, go for it. If you want to put whatever you want to put in your whiskey, if you paid for it, if you bought the bottle, go for it.
But I can.
If you come to my house, I won't look askance at you. If you want to put a cube of ice in your whiskey, that's fine. My standard rule around here is that if you come to my house, with the exception of about 4 or 5 bottles that were either signed by and given to me by distillers who have since passed away, or signed by distillers who have passed away.
Yeah.
Or the one bottle that I'm saving for my grandson, who you saw earlier tonight.
Right.
Because a few years before he was born, back in 2012, I was at a Johnny Walker event in New York City for Father's Day. And I knew he was going to be a boy, and I knew his name was going to be Hunter, so I had a bottle engraved for him.
Oh,
And a bottle of Blue Label, Johnny Walker Blue Label, that said, to Hunter, enjoy this on your 21st birthday, love, Grandpa.
Aww.
That's his bottle. It's not for me to open, and it's not for his parents to open. Hopefully I'll be around when he's 21 and we can open it together, but if I'm not, it's a memento. But other than that, there isn't a bottle up here in my office, in the studio here, that I won't open for somebody if they really want to try it. It's for sharing. It's for having fun. It's for making memories. We have a lot of people who talk about investing in whiskeys so they can make money. As far as I'm concerned, the best investment you can make in whiskey is to share it with good friends and family and make memories, because those never lose their value.
I have to agree with that. People spend money on things. I spend money on experiences.
Yep.
And that's what kind of matters, What do you have to add to your own life? Not a thing, but an experience. Because stories are amazing, aren't they?
Yeah. That's why I joke about telling my family, either have a great party, make some more memories, share some memories of me, or give me the Viking funeral that everybody will remember. Because admittedly, 90% of the bottles down here were sent to me as samples. Yeah. I'll never sell them. They've all been opened. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to sell a single bottle on the secondary market. My goal is to have fun and to learn.
That's what it should be about. I mean, it's just, people who associate learning with an arduous task. That's not what learning should be. It should be fun. It should be a part of your life and something that you enjoy. And if you enjoy it, dive in. Learn everything you can about a thing. It's like, I hate Game of Thrones. I absolutely hate the series, but I have seen every episode, so I can thoroughly say I hate this show. And yes, I have seen every episode, and I hate it. It's like, I'm going to be fully knowledgeable in my not liking of a thing.
I have the sample kit here of all of the Game of Thrones single malts. And you will find my tasting notes for them on the website.
So if you
I have not
learn...
watched an episode of Game of Thrones since season 1. And my family jokes when I walk into the room when they're watching one of the current episodes, don't look, you don't want to spoil it.
Oh my goodness. And
I haven't watched an episode of Game of Thrones in 4 years.
Oh my God. Like after
I'll never catch up on it.
After the first, and I watched the first season, I was like, okay, I bought into the first season. Then the second season came along, like everybody's just going to die. Yeah, that's what happened. Okay. And then we have more of all this horrible activity from people where they're mean to each other. Okay, yeah, there's more of that. Okay. So that's like every single episode I can expect for people to be horrible to each other. More degradation of women. Okay. Fantastic. All right. So the jerk's still in power. Great. Well, he's gone. Now his mom, who's a jerk, is in power. Okay. And then we're going to have all these people who are jerks that are going to do things. Okay. Like, I just. Game of Thrones put me to sleep. And people are like, but it was so graphic. I'm like, graphic violence that's predictable is just as boring as I don't think people understand, at least for me, if I don't have something that's engaging on an intellectual level, it doesn't matter if you have all the flashy dragons and the pretty. Well, they spend all this time on the War of the Bastards. I'm like, okay, the Battle of the Bastards or whatever. That was like a huge ordeal. I'm like, well, I get that they spend a lot of time on the cinematography, but it just, there was no buy-in for me. I was not emotionally invested at all whatsoever. And I'm like, it's predictable. Oh, this person's going to die. Oh, look, they did. It's after a while it became so like M. Night Shyamalan. It's like they have given away their formula in the first episode. In like the first season, they're like, we're setting the stage. So after that, my brain, because I have a very analytical brain, I'm like, oh, well, everybody's expendable. Nobody matters. And whoever wins, and nobody cares. And that's exactly what happened throughout the entire series, all the way through the end. And I'm like, this is just like every other show I've ever watched in every capacity. Here, we have this. And people on Twitter are like, but this and this. So I got a lot of backlash for like, but you guys don't understand. This literally looks like X-Men. It looks like this over here. Here's an example here. Here's an example of the same writing here. Here's the example of the same writing here.
Yeah.
It's just like there's nothing inherently creative. And if you're going to blame anybody, let's blame the Greeks because they already wrote everything. So if you're going to get upset, get mad at all the ancient people who already wrote all this stuff in a completely, in a similar way. We're just borrowing from the Greeks. When it comes
Plagiarism is the sincerest form of flattery.
But
I kid.
I don't find it interesting, kind of, and the way that Game of Thrones ended. They were going this route of, we're going to have this woman on the throne, and that is not what happened at all in the end. They're like, well, here's this woman who's handling all of this stuff and making the world better, but we're going to suddenly make her evil. And then this guy is going to have to kill her because, she's gone evil suddenly. And so we need the men to save the world from the evil woman. I'm like, this is like everything I've ever seen.
Well, you could make the argument that power corrupts equally across gender lines.
That's true. But...
absolute power corrupts absolutely.
I agree. But why must we always have this man who's in love with this woman always have to kill her because he has to be the guy that kills her? And I'm like...
You're revealing spoilers here for those of us who haven't seen it yet.
I don't think you're going to watch it.
No, but there's somebody out there that might.
If they haven't seen it by now, then they're just losers. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
She said that. I didn't.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But I will say, it's just, there's so many problematic elements to the fact that as a woman, every time I see a woman in power, particularly like if we talk about superheroes, like in the DC universe, anytime a woman that's in power, she has something mentally wrong with her, or she's evil, or she has to be objectified in order to be accepted by her peers. That is every single case across the board from what I see in my standpoint. So anytime that there's a woman in power, she's either not able to handle it, or she's evil, or we have to objectify her in a sexual manner in order to accept her into this world. But that's just That's me, but that's what I often see, and there is some science on that. I actually wrote an article why the Wonder Woman film was important, because nobody objectified her in that way. She was part of the team. They needed her to fulfill the mission, and she was there for no other reason but it was the right thing to do. And I'm like, that's what we need. So I don't know.
I can't help you there. I didn't watch any of the DC movies.
Yeah, you're not missing much, but you should watch Wonder Woman. It's amazing. And I'm like,
Oh, I did watch that one, but I don't watch the that one I did watch, but I don't the rest of the canon. I'm not a DC Universe person.
That's okay. I completely understand. I absolutely love Jean Grey in like the Marvel Universe. She's amazing. But with the DC Universe, with Wonder Woman, that film, No Man's Land, brings me to tears every single time. It's freaking amazing. When she's walking across that and they're like, no man has ever crossed past there. We haven't been able to move like a centimeter because that's just like, this isn't what you're here to do, but this is what I'm here to do. And I'm going to do this. We're going to get this done. We're going to help these people. I'm just like, this is like my girl. It was like tears. So I can't. Because this, to me, that moment was so pivotal because we see so many women in science, women in engineering, to where they have taken, and the guys are going, she's taking all the fire. Like every single woman in the history of science has taken all the fire so the guys can get through. And I was just like, that is like a metaphor for everything ever that I've ever had to. It's like, oh my God, it's perfect. So it's completely different situation. I get, we've completely derailed from whiskey, talking about Wonder Woman. She's right there. But anyway, but to me, Game of Thrones completely threw all of that out the window and regressed back to the typical storytelling that I see all the time everywhere else. And I was so bored with that.
You expected anything less from Hollywood?
Shame on me.
Well, no, it's just it's typical. I'm sorry. It's not right, but you want to change it, write something better.
Yeah. Fair enough. Oh,
I can't do it. I can't write anything better. If I could, I would have been out in Hollywood.
Yeah, they don't personally call me and ask me my opinion. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the Nielsen ratings will actually call me. How do you feel about this? I'm like, well, let me tell you. So, but they don't always, whatever. So I'm going to go through the last little bit because we derailed a bit towards.
Yeah, we kind of went to train wreck status here.
Okay. Anyway, so we're moving on. Let's see. I'm checking for any particular questions. Okay. So whiskycast.com is in the description. Click on that. Oh, goodness. Why did we talk about Game of Thrones? That was such a bad idea.
You're getting hammered for that, aren't you?
Probably. I'll probably get hammered for that later, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, let's see. Jameson Caskmates, Irish Whiskey Asian Stout. Okay, so I guess Hemp Hill is a fan of that, or IPA casks.
I like them both the stout and the IPA cask.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. In Game of Thrones, the most exciting thing was the Starbucks cup. Fair enough. There was a Starbucks cup that was left in one of the scenes. Oh my goodness. Okay. The Wonder Woman comic was created to show that women could be powerful and lead. Yes. True. True enough, Hemp Hill. That is all the questions. All right. Any last thoughts on whiskey?
Drink it the way you like. Drink it responsibly and enjoy it. And just make sure you share the stories with good friends. That's all I can say.
What is whiskey if not shared with friends, and have a good story associated with that.
That's it. Sláinte.
And is it Slante or is it Slancho?
Sláinte.
Slancha. Okay, as they say.
Technically, it's Slánjava. But I just go with Sláinte.
Slánjava. There is actually an Irish pub that's in my town, owned by an Irishman who had furniture imported. He primarily has Dewar's as his particular whiskey. And
Okay.
he has Magner cider on tap, and I'm like, why Magner's? It's not my favorite at all. But
it is popular in Scotland and Ireland.
you know, it is. Magner's.
If you're going to run an authentic Scottish or Irish pub, you got to have Magners.
I guess. So it's funny because I had friends of mine from London visit about 4 years ago. They're huge Elvis fans and Al Green fans, and so we were all hanging out and stuff. And I took them to this pub, and I'm like, well, they were like, well, we have Magners. Like, oh my gosh. Like, okay. And so I guess I'll have that since it's on tap, but they don't have a lot of UK based ciders on tap out here, which is a shame. Outside of Strongbow and Strongbow. Anywho.
No.
Strongbow is not that much better than what is that other cider that comes out of California. I can't remember now.
I'm not a cider person, so I can't help you here.
It's not woodchuck. It's not red apple. It's the other one, and it's very popular, and I can't think of it. So.
And you'll think of it after we come off the show.
I will. I will think of it after we leave the show. I have had probably too much whiskey for this particular cast.
And you've only had 2.
I think it's 3. Because I had 2 of the Glenlivet.
Oh, okay.
And I had one of these, and each one was 2 of my fingers. So I had 1 of the Saxton, 2 of the Glenlivets, because I did finish that other one. I was sneaky with that. So.
Well, I caught you. You're not driving, though. So
oh,
that's good.
No, I'm at home for the evening. And then tomorrow morning, I have to talk about Inflationary Universe on my channel. So it's a hard life being a science communicator, where we're talking about whiskey one night, and the very next day, I'm going to talk about Inflationary Universe at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time.
So you basically probably ought to call it a night and get some sleep, because
I will be up with
10
the
a.m.
chicken.
Central Time is going to come a lot sooner than you'd like in the morning, I think.
Well, I'm used to getting up pretty early anyway, but I tend to do all of my research and put together my shows the same day that I come out with them. So tomorrow morning, I will get up about 6 a.m., compile all of my resources, and put together a show on Inflationary Universe. So
Can't wait.
So thank you, Mark, for being here. This has been amazing.
Thank you for having me.
This has been absolutely fun. Hopefully I didn't turn into like silly whiskey girl in the end, whatever. So I think you're being kind.
Who, me? Nah, you're fine.
Okay.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this has been amazing. Do check out Whiskycast, where he talks about the latest and greatest in whiskey science and everything to do, particularly with what was the new whiskey that they're...
We're going to talk about Glyph this week.
Glyph
on the
this
show.
week.
It'll be out on Sunday.
So do check them out. Thank you, Mark, for being here. This has been so much fun.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you guys in the chat for asking such profound and wonderful questions to kind of give us a better idea of what makes whiskeys different and how are they, distilled and everything associated with that. I've learned a lot this particular episode. That's been amazing. So, yay! And please do like, share, and subscribe. Check out Whiskycast and everything that Mark does on his show. And I will see you guys next time. And so I'm going to show my patron video, and then we will sign out, and I will see you guys tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Good night.
Good night.